We give you what you need to know as we discuss issues of national concern. Now, this morning, we are going to be discussing something very important, I must say. Very, very important. However, more times, we seem not to give it the priority attention that it deserves. And we are looking at shock responsive social protection in the face of Chitezi. But one would not only talk about Chitezi. As we speak today, have landslides in a number of parts in this country, and also learned that our brothers and sisters in the Antonde, all is not well because fire gutted, I think, a market. Yes. And a lot of property has been destroyed there. So it's basically moving around social protection. When shock strikes, how responsive, how prepared are we? Now, I'm delighted because I have people that matter so much in Uganda, and these are the people that make our laws, but also ensure that we have right policies in place and do a lot of advocacy. Now, this morning I have Honorable Flavia Kabahenda, who is a member of Parliament for Rabuhoro, for a member of Parliament for Chegwegwa. Yes. But most important, she's the chairperson of the Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection. So for today's discussion, she happens to be the chairperson of the Social Protection Committee of Parliament. And another member I have this morning, he's Honorable Dr. George Didi Bahako, who is a member of Parliament for Obongi constituency. The last name disturbed me a bit even outside, but the good thing is I have the guest with me who will pronounce that better. But he is also a member of the Social Protection Committee of Parliament. Honorable Flavia, good morning and most welcome. Good morning,
the moderator. I'm delighted to be here after some long time, but I'm glad I'm here. Last night when I received a message that you had a disturbance of lightning, I said, oh, now the program, will it be there? But good enough, we are glad we are here. Good morning, Uganda. Good morning, Chegegwa. Good morning, all the people there listening to us.
Okay, and the extreme end, Honorable, I'll not risk that name again. Let me just say, Honorable George, you most welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Good morning, my dear listeners out there. My name is Dr. Boka Didi George, Member of Parliament of Bongi constituency, a member of the Social Protection Forum of the Parliament of Uganda, but also the Health Committee of Parliament. Thank you.
Now, I want to begin with you, Honorable. Usually, when we talk about social protection, what runs in the minds of many Ugandans is planning for your retirement, planning for old age. Now, today we are looking at social protection in terms of response to shocks. Help us create a picture or define for us well what is social protection.
Actually, shock responsiveness is social protection itself. Because it's unfortunate that up to now, very many people, including duty bearers, have refused to understand social protection, even when we practice it in our day-to-day running of things. For example, why does a woman prepare for giving birth? Why does she prepare a suitcase before birth? Is to prepare for shocks. That this baby at its birth must find a planned, a responsive kind of reception. Why do we have granaries, which anyway people have thrown away of recent? People had granaries where we grew up from, to prepare for droughts, to prepare for famine. They say, let us put this food aside, put it in the granary, so that in case a shock brought out by famine or drought came about, it would find us with food. Why do people say, let me plan for my retirement? let me do this and this so that when I retire, I can retire honorably. All that is social protection. We have been practicing it, and we really practice it. Some people these days have even started planning for their death, to the extent of even procuring their coffins, and say, well, when I die, I don't want to disturb people, so all my things are set. We have funeral services now that are taking money before we die, so that you prepare. At your death, you get a decent and respectable funeral. All that is social protection. So we have been practicing it, much as I think some people need a very technical kind of definition for social protection. It is not about the older persons alone. It's about everybody from birth to death. It's a life cycle approach to responsiveness and comprehensiveness. And so, but World Bank, of course, gives a better definition, especially for governments and countries. These are policies, programs, and plans to support the people of a particular country or a particular nation to make sure that they build resilience so that these people, when they are faced with shocks, they are able to pick up themselves, or at just a little response from a government, these people can come up again and pick up a new future or a second chance future, and then they are mitigating vulnerability, they are mitigating poverty, they are mitigating these shocks that come with the vulnerability. Like now Kitezi becomes our case study. It's just a case study. We are not discussing shock responsiveness only for Kitezi, but we have a number of things. As we talked last week, in Masindi, some primary school in Masindi, a classroom block fell. It killed 2 teachers. It killed 7 children, pupils. That's a shock to that school. And so the government needed to have those kind of responses. Like even assessing buildings of public schools to ensure that we mitigate the shocks that would come if a building collapsed. Because most of the buildings, by the way, in primary schools, especially in the rural areas, those which are public schools, my friend, anything is going to happen because they are in dilapidated state. They are about to collapse on people. They are about to collapse on pupils and students. And so government systems that work, they keep assessing situations, recording data that is reliable and utilizable to ensure that there is mitigation of shocks, because that's the first you can do to mitigate shocks. But when a shock comes, then it requires you to do responsiveness, do proper coordination. Meaningful coordination does not coordinate agencies, it coordinates processes. That is how they respond to shocks. So today we are seeing a number of agencies sitting. We have been in a meeting the whole day. We have been in a meeting doing what? For us, we want responsiveness for the shock that we have received from Kitezi, not meetings of agencies. We need processes. We want to know, have you disaggregated these victims? Have you disaggregated them to the effect that there are those who may not very easily build again in the very near, because their shock was terrible. There are those who are in the middle ground there. If you just injected some little thing, they would come up. And there are those who have already actually found another belonging and they're moving on. So if you say everyone who is a victim should go to the tent, and then you start giving them food, and you think all of them have got the same shock, I think that is to do lip service and to simply blindfold. So for governments and countries that are prepared, they always assess to ensure mitigation.
Now, here I want to bring in Doctor. Doctor, when we talk about social protection in terms of response to shock, we have a full ministry. That is, we have the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness. It is there, and we know very well One time, somebody told me that we are not going to get money and put it there for disaster. Suppose we can't budget for the unknown. So when we talk about government preparation in terms of social responsibility, I want an assessment from you.
Thank you, Robert, and my listeners out there. First and foremost, I want to start by extending my heartfelt condolences to the individuals, families, and the communities that got affected by the Chitezi landslide. For those that have died, may their souls rest in peace. For those that are in the hospitals, may they recover. And for those that have been affected in various ways, grappling with how to cope up with the consequences of the landslide, we commiserate with them. First and foremost, when we talk about social protection, we are referring to the set of policies and practices that a family, a community, an institution, and a country, and as a global community, we need to put in place. First and foremost, to detect through a surveillance system and an early warning system. Two, to swing to action in terms of response in the event that there is a disaster or a shock. And in the response, there's what we need to do within the first 48 hours, guided by the SPHERE standards. There's what we need to do within the first 1 week, and there's what we need to do within the first 1 month and so on, which means emergency response, early recovery, rehabilitation, and progressing to sustainable development within the context of disaster preparedness. Coming to the question you asked about, we have a dedicated ministry that handles disasters. How have we been taken as a country and aware of the crisis that happened at Chitezi? The matter we're looking at is a matter of rights. The right to life, the right to safety and security, and the right to protection by duty bearers. And the first duty bearer is the state, the government of Uganda, supported by the various partners, civil society, private sector, faith-based organizations, traditional cultural institutions, including communities and households. Looking at this from a social protection perspective, what should we have done? One is we have a legal and regulatory framework as a country that guides us in a disaster preparedness and response. To what extent do we make the citizens and the institutions in ministries, departments, and agencies aware of being disaster prepared and response, so they understand the policy framework, the legal and regulatory framework. The second is public education and awareness creation, sensitization
For the masses.
on the likely risks that are likely to befall us, the probability of this happening, and what we need to do in the event that it happens, which would then inform our national preparedness and response plan guided by our policy framework. We then need to ensure that we pre-position resources and capabilities for us to be able to swing to action
in case
in the event that something happened. The Chitezi tragedy has been a time bomb since 2015, Robert. And this has been brought to the attention of government, government wide, and the Office of the Prime Minister has been aware of this. KCCA has been bringing up the issue of Chitezi in their budget framework papers, the ministerial policy statements, the annual work plans and budgets, including this year in January, when they
KCCA
requested for resources to put in place measures to avert the crisis. Unfortunately, for reasons beyond our control, we as a country were unable to put in place the mechanisms that would have averted this. That's the context within which we're looking at this. Moving forward, what we needed to do is, one, the search and rescue team operations. That up to now, 9 days down the road is going on. We appreciate the emergency preparedness and response team that has swung to action to do the search and recovery operations that has resulted in the recovery of people who are alive and that are receiving medical care, the excavation of those that have died, the numbers go to about 30 people, and a number of other property and assets that got affected by the landslide. What for now, as a country, we need to focus on, number one, is the emergency response phase, ensuring the dead are buried. And I'm happy that the day before yesterday, KCCA visited the site and the families and condoled with them and extended support. Two is to ensure that those that are in the hospitals and the health facilities receiving medical care are provided appropriate care. But as we provided them care, we need to use this opportunity to review our medical emergency preparedness and response, because many of those deaths would have been saved if our emergency medical services swung to action as shiftily as possible. For those that have been displaced, certainly they need food and non-food items, including shelter, starting with temporary shelter, but ultimately ensuring that they have appropriate shelter.
I saw the government value
when we look
to value and see how much it's going to take, all that.
When we look at citizens settling near a landfill, garbage collection site,
200-meter buffer zone,
it means there's something wrong. That as duty bearers and law enforcement agents, we haven't. If you categorize the kind of people who settled around the landfill, they are the vulnerable and the most vulnerable of society. Most of whom are children and women that survive on scavenging on the waste that has been dumped at the site. So we need to see to it that those that are displaced are provided an alternative site where they are relocated and resettled. And that requires the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and the KCCA to look into our housing policy, and especially housing for the urban poor. If we move around the city and the peri-urban settings, the situation in which our urban poor are living is very, very pathetic. We need to review our settlement policies, especially housing for the vulnerable, the poor, the urban poor. So that needs to be taken care of. Temporarily, they may be accommodated in schools, but the schools need their buildings for the children to learn. We may have to mobilize through the Office of the Prime Minister maybe some tents as a short-term measure, but medium, long-term, we have to ensure we have appropriate shelter provided for the persons that have been affected by the landslide. Many of the people that are affected have been thriving by scavenging on the garbage that is being dumped there. A fundamental question from a public health and environmental perspective that arises is, to what extent have we, as a nation and a government, put in place a comprehensive and sustainable waste management system?
And that's why I want to bring in Honorable
Flavia.
When you talk about comprehensive and sustainable, now, Doctor mentioned the phases of how we can have this comprehensive and sustainable response. Not only talking about Chitezi, because we have a number of, we've had these disasters before us. Like we said, the Antonde, you mentioned the school, but these require money. Social protection Now in terms of shock, one would say maybe disaster preparedness. These require monies. When you said KCCA has been forwarding this over and over, is it that you're not prioritizing, or is it that you can only cut a coat according to your piece of cloth, and our cloth does not enable us to make that as big as we want it?
Yeah, in 1995, the Constituency Assembly, when they were discussing the development of the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, in Objective 23 and Article 249, actually the people of Uganda called for an end to intolerable, persistent loss of lives, suffering and disruption of economic activities by disasters that result from non-preparedness, non-responsiveness, and uncoordinated kind of structures. That's why they put it in the Constitution. And it did not stop there. In 2010-11, a national disaster risk management strategy policy was actually enacted. And this policy covered broad subjects of vulnerability, responses, assessment, mitigation, and shock responsiveness. And this clearly could compound into a comprehensive disaster risk management plan. In 2022, the Minister of State for Disaster Preparedness then, the Honorable Esther Anyakun, laid to Parliament a national disaster risk management plan. And I remember in her comments, she observed and noted that in the year 2020, Uganda did not only lose lives and livelihoods from disasters, but that we lost 536 billion managing disasters. That's a lot of money. When we start talking about there is no money, we cut, you know, mitigation will reduce the cost that you would actually be forced to make just in case a shock came about. Like now, I equally condole with the families that are victims, the people who lost their loved ones, who are bereaved, the people who have been displaced. And my observation is that most of them were women, and up to now, they are women suffering, children. You know, women are hustlers. For them, they can make a livelihood anywhere, as long as it is about them surviving with their children. And so I would like to really also express my condolences to the families. But this government has a legal framework that really shows us what to do. To prepare is the best. And disaster preparedness is not about disaster responsiveness. Preparedness will cut the cost by more than a half.
Now, Honorable, when you talk about preparedness, this is where I need you to be more clear. You see, we have man-made disasters, we have natural disasters, but you're talking about how do we prepare ourselves so that when these, actually, prepare also requires averting them from happening.
Yes, mitigation.
And also in case that they happen, so that always the impact is minimal. If at all we've managed to mitigate, then that is the good thing about it. So how do we prepare? How do we prepare? That's why I thought that one time, that's what a politician told me, but how do you expect us to, we have a lot of things to budget for, and we say we may have a landslide in Mbale, we may have the Chitezi fall, we may have this, so, you know, we allocate.
You know, preparedness does not necessarily need you money. We have people in offices, we have duty bearers. If the planning unit of KCCA was really up to the task, having only one dump site in the whole city for close to 30 years, I think was not to prepare well. Within the 28 years, the office responsible in KCCA should have known that at around 15 years, this dump site requires that we establish another one. Because the 13 tons of garbage that is deposited, that was being deposited to Kitezi every day, was almost a tenth of the garbage that is actually generated in this city, metropolitan. That alone requires that we had more dump sites. So that is why we are seeing very much garbage in the swamps, in the bush, behind people's places, even in the city itself. We are seeing a lot of garbage redundant. People don't know how to go about it. Why? We had only one dump site. It could only consume 13,000 tons. So the extra did not have anywhere to go, meaning there should have been a plan to have more dump sites, and that would not have costed us a lot, because we should have done it well in time and not in a rush. And even to plan, I already alluded to the fact that even in our homes, there are some plans we make for the future to mitigate, to respond to shocks. Because if you don't keep food for famine, when famine comes, you'll buy the food very expensively, because you will not stop eating because famine has struck. You won't stop eating because drought has struck, even landslides. Bududa, for instance, is known to slide every year. Where is the plan? Because every time it slides, we are in shock. We are running around. We are running around. And yet we know that even next year it will do the same. Kasese will break its banks. And we are never prepared. Even if COVID returned today, I don't know how much prepared we are. Because even the beds we bought, I don't know where they have packed them to be ready for any other shock that may come about, Ebola and all those kind of things. So I think preparedness requires frugality. It requires a real comprehensive and up-to-the-task planning system. It requires assessments that are regular, because we cannot be woken up by disasters every day. We must go ahead of them, be able to detect, be able to mitigate, and be able to even sensitize publics around places where we think they are disaster prone, and then we start doing resettlement plans in time. Whatever, a stitch in time saves 9. So now we are going to talk about finances, because we have been put in a shock because of those who did not plan. When you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so any country that has a strong social protection system, and when we talk about a system, we are looking at a life cycle approach to social protection. From birth to death. When women are pregnant, who cares? I always tell people that every adult you see is just a child who survived. No one did much. We only survived, and here we are. But today, we cannot rely on people simply surviving. Our governments, our institutions, our families need to put in place systems that will create people fallback positions and social safety network, safety nets where people will fall to in case of vulnerabilities. And so, one is the system from birth to death. And that system requires data. If up to now we cannot seriously register the children that are born in this country, birth registration is hanging there, we cannot plan for people whose numbers we don't know.
We rely on the national census.
We rely now just on the national census, and for those who hid themselves from the census, we shall not be able to know where they are and what they are. And the second thing is a social registry that will track the people of this country as they go on from birth. At 3 years, is this child in a nursery somewhere? At 6 years, has this child joined any school somewhere? at 11 years, has this child transited to secondary school? So we are able to track even those who fall in shock. We are able to track those who lose jobs. We are able to track those who lose incomes, those who fall in vulnerability. And what we don't know is that every one of us is a candidate of vulnerability. We may not necessarily be poor, but we are very vulnerable, including me. And so I would like to implore from family to government that let us end with this as a shock. We were shocked by COVID. Everyone was running around. The country was begging for food from its people, even when it is the one that would have actually supplied the food. Now they were begging food from people. Whoever has a bunch of banana, whoever has what. I mean, that is embarrassing. And today, another embarrassment has come around. Kitezi. As we talk, the complementary problems that are coming from this tragedy is that now, go around the city, all garbage is packed.
Yes.
Because the garbage collectors now don't know where next to put the garbage.
Yes.
We had only one landfill, and it is now causing a disaster. And secondly, these women, the very many women who have died, the very women who have been displaced, the very many women who are now in tents seeking for relief, are not actually the only ones who are benefiting from this landfill. Behind the scenes, there are big shots who have been benefiting from this Kitezi. Recycling companies, what not. Very many, the people doing, processing this garbage into manure, people have been even feeding these insects, the black insects, to make food for animals. These days, I hear they even now make food for people. The black flies. They are making even food for people. Since I'm a refugee host, they are bringing them to children's porridge, so that their nutrition content is very high. So look at the big shots, companies, institutions, and other related individuals who are rich that have been benefiting from this Kitezi. And we did not see them in the limelight, but they are behind the scenes. For who were these women collecting the garbage, for instance? Were they taking the garbage?
Well, you're just reminding me of something I said earlier on in this show in the morning, that in this Kitezi issue, there is something that we have not given due attention.
I think so.
That maybe these issues we are talking about, it was supposed to be decommissioned so many years back. There wasn't. Let's look at the businesses that have been running in Kitezi.
That have been thriving.
That have been thriving.
Yes.
Some small industries around there, micro industries, where a person even brings a generator, installs some. There's been some business there.
Yes, of course.
Who are the people in these businesses? The actual people in this business, not the ones we are seeing. Could there be an issue of conflict of interest that maybe it has hindered the progressive decommissioning of this site, or even seeking for an alternative site? Because when you go to Nkumba, I have not seen such being there. When you go to those other dumping sites, minor as they may be, these activities are not there. But I want to bring in Doctor here. Now, Doctor, when we look at our response in Kitezi and other disasters that we've said, because there's just a case study, one would ask, first, you people in Parliament that allocate the monies, do we have enough money for this process? Is it a priority in your allocations? Because now I have you here. We may be here talking social protection, but when it comes to approving and having a proper budget, because when you talk about being warned, this is a disaster, but each financial year it comes up KCCA and doesn't get the funds, I question the members of Parliament there. Two, do we have the right people who know what it takes to have an element of social protection in terms of shock? Doctor.
Actually, maybe before Doctor comes in, I sit on the Committee on Climate Change. And at the beginning of last year, my Committee on Climate Change visited Kitezi. We wrote a comprehensive report, submitted it to Parliament. Only that, we were told to just lay it, and that the leadership of Parliament would find time for it to be discussed. It's now a whole year, and we were warning government about Kitezi, because we found very many women there, actually more people than the birds. People were competing with birds at that Kitezi. And we saw a field that was getting up and up, and that it would cause a disaster anytime. Not only a disaster like it has happened now, but also pollution of all the water bodies that were around that people were using for their water sources. Also the odor. It was so smelly. And you could see these women with masks, some of them putting on 3 masks to mean, but still that was very unhealthy. And their children were around them, also on the landfill, and you couldn't put masks on the child, so the child were bare nose, and the whole thing was very, very unhealthy. And we put all this before Parliament, and we thought that possibly the Ministry of Water and Environment would take advantage of these reports even before they are discussed, to make sure that they start looking around for certain interventions that they would make, to make sure, because we even proposed for another dump site, because this one was getting filled, this one was now causing a pollution disaster, and now today it has crumbled on people's homes, on people's businesses. And of course the people in business actually are going to also suffer. They have lost business. They have lost income. They have lost lives of some of their workers. They have lost sources of their inputs. And so government may find itself even addressing issues of the small businesses, SMEs, and bigger businesses that have been thriving on these Kitezi.
Yes, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And listeners, the question you raised on financing, sustainable financing for our disaster preparedness and response plan, goes back to, do we have a national disaster preparedness and response system that will be able to swing to action in the event that any disaster occurs anytime? Dear listeners, the world has become very risky. Man-made as well as natural disasters can hit us anyhow. A robust disaster preparedness and response system, first and foremost, must be backed by law. A good and evolving legal and regulatory framework. At national level, regional level, including community-based legal and regulatory instruments that can include bylaws and ordinances in the local governments. 2, we must have a governance structure. And matters of disaster preparedness and response are government-wide, society-wide, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, and multi-level. So in recognition of that, that's why the Office of the Prime Minister is the best placed supra-ministry to coordinate the national disaster preparedness and response policies, strategies, programs, financing, and service delivery and accountability mechanisms. We need to review our disaster preparedness and response governance structures at all levels of our government. Thirdly, is the planning for disasters as part of our short-term, medium-term, and our long-term strategic planning. To what extent do we prioritize disasters in our Vision 2040? In the National Development Plan 4 that right now we're crafting, in our regional development plans, in our district development plans in the local governments, up to the community level, including households and families. I must be disaster prepared in my household and family. From planning, we need to look into the sustainable financing component.
And that's where I have a lot of
that requires us to be able not only to look at the expenditure component, but also the revenue component, from both domestic financing as well as external offshore financing. To what extent do we, as a government, at central level, regional level, lower and higher local governments, ensure we mobilize, we leverage, we allocate sufficient and necessary resources for us to be able to respond to any shock that hits us, whether man-made or not, including the Chitesis. The law requires us, Robert, to put aside 3% of the national budget as a contingency fund to help us swing to action in the event that any disaster happens.
In which budget in the history of Uganda?
Every budget of the government of
in which
Uganda.
budget? In which financial year? Have we
Every financial year.
It's
a legal requirement.
It's provided for by the law.
It's a legal requirement.
Yes. And even
that's
the
why,
commission,
and it's backed by the
commission.
Public Finance Management Act.
But do we live to that?
That is the question
That's
that
the
we need
problem.
to ask ourselves.
Because when I look
The
at
Minister of
what takes-
Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the executive need to be interrogated on to what extent, are they activating that 3% provision of the 73 trillion that Parliament appropriated in this financial year. Most of our disaster preparedness and response efforts are being financed or bankrolled by our neighbors, external financing, WHO, USAID, UK aid, this and that. I think we need to mature as an independent country to begin looking at ways and means of mobilizing domestic financing at all levels, starting with us in our households and families, to our community financing mechanisms,
now,
to our local
sorry
governments.
To cut you short, time seems to be flying very fast, but we are talking about social protection in terms of how we respond to shocks. Now, Chitezi has been a case study this morning, but when I talk about social protection, I look at it in a sustainable manner, that if we've not been able to mitigate or avoid the shock, now when it happens, I view it like when I insure myself. For example, if I insure my bike or my car in comprehensive insurance, that in case of disaster, I can be able to return to that very situation or slightly better to that. Now, do we have that plan as government? Today I'm seeing the government valuer going to people's houses, how much it was of value. Now when you return shelter to me, you may not return my ability to fend for my family. And this is what I want us to peep into. When we look at the people in landslides, when we had the Bududa, if these are given houses to relocate, yes, they have been given shelter. What about the other continuous plan? Like the livelihood element of it, Honorable, please.
Yeah, that's why shock responsive social protection is different from preparedness. Because we failed on the preparedness, we can now discuss the responsiveness. The responsiveness would be, first of all, disaggregate the victims. Just put them in classes. Because they were not the same. The companies were not the same as this poor woman who left her 3 children, for whom she was getting fees out of just touching in that dirty garbage. They may not recover the same way that maybe companies would recover. Maybe companies were insured. We can never know. So the disaggregation becomes the very first thing, because we need this data. Secondly, we can do what we call scalability. We already have some social protection interventions, few as they may be, because the status is at 0.1% of GDP that we provide in social protection as a country. But can we scale up the already existing social protection implementations, like cash grants, so that we can give cash reliefs, so that we can give food and non-food items, that like we have been giving in the ministry or in the office of the Prime Minister? We can do a scale up, because that becomes a bit flexible. And again, if some of the victims were older persons who we are supposed to give money for, say, 25,000 per month, maybe we can raise the figure for these people for some time.
Remember that money was also
Yes, I know.
It was also reduced
but
we
are talking about responsiveness.
Yes.
We would use, first of all, run to the already existing social protection
programs that we have.
And see whether we can flex them a bit. And maybe this older person now who was getting 25, we could raise him to 50,000 for about 6 months or a year so that they recover. And the grant for people with disabilities, in case there were people who have now become disabled, we quickly enroll them on the program for the national grant for people with disabilities, on the special grant for older persons. We would first use those. And secondly, in such responses, we don't need to recruit. We already have systems. The system that gives this money to older persons can be run to quickly assist us run this emergency response, because they already have a system. They already have the workmanship, they already have the human resource. Let's use the existing first. Exhaust them, then we can, but in these kind of things, you will quickly see people recruiting emergency response teams so that their people can get jobs, can get some little money of the immediate, and then by the time we realize the money that would go to the victims is actually given to these people we call response teams, when we already have some kind of programs running with some minimal human resource. If SAGE can run the whole country on SAGE, it could run the Kitezi response team, because in any case SAGE is given after 3 months. So within the other 3 months, they are there. We can use them. We have these ones running the PWD's grants. We have these ones running NutriCash. We have all these human resource, but it will surprise you that they will need now to quickly recruit emergency response teams so that people can eat quick money, so that their people can be accommodated, and all those kind of things. And all this goes back to draining what would sustain us as financing. And of course, we need now to look at the designs of our programs that are existing already, the labor intensive program under OPM, and see whether some of the women who survived can be accommodated in the labor intensive programs. So for me, as the chairperson of the Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection, I would love to see the immediate, as making sure we use the existing programs to ensure they do quick response, as the government builds up what we can do in the medium term and what we would do in the long term. But as we talk now, let us have another landfill, or else all of us are going to face a disaster in the very near future in this city.
Well, thank you so much, Honorable. Now I want to go to Doctor to have your parting shot. Much as we have talked about already existing programs that Honorable Flavia feels we should just now look out to identify who are the victims and which category do they fit in. Yes. Can we prioritize them? One would say we've been talking of what should be done, but in your parting shots, I want us to look at practicability of what we've discussed. How possible? She talked of finding a landfill. Yesterday, I was watching the Lord Mayor on TV crying out, help us. The other side we've been denied. Here we've been refused. Please come to our rescue. These people are giving reasons that don't carry water, but anyway, we respect them. So let's look at the practicability of your suggestions on this show as you wind up.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and listeners out there. As we wind up, the practical things that I look forward to seeing done are, number one, the search and rescue mission should be time-bound. Resources have to be made available to the rescue team to ensure they accomplish their business as quickly as possible. Number two
but is it still as search and rescue? Do you still...
after 9 days, I don't think it will be as rescue.
Rescue, yes.
Yes. Two is the care, treatment and care for the people who are in the hospitals. We need to see to it that they're provided appropriate medical care. Three is for those that have been displaced, that have no shelter. We need, as government and partners, to see to it that they have shelter on their head. food and non-food items, and access to safe water and sanitation, amongst others. 4 is the livelihood of those that have been affected, who have been surviving on scavenging and selling the products that they get from the landfill. 5 is the disaster in the waiting by the garbage that is not being collected right now, that requires government and partners to quickly swing to action to see to it that alternative sites, not a site, are put in place. But in managing this waste, I think we need to put in place and apply appropriate technologies for us to be able to ensure waste becomes wealth for us, instead of what we can talk about as being smelly and this and that. Segregation of waste is important, biodegradable, non-degradable. For the biodegradable, we get wealth from it through manure, fertilizers and the like, and the non-degradable are recyclable. I want to emphasize extended user responsibility by the people that generate this waste. I think we need to hold them accountable for both the degradable and non-degradable waste, starting with us in our households and families. Littering must stop, and the stopping of littering starts with me. Segregation of waste must start, and the starting is in my home, where I have 2 bins, one for biodegradable and one for non-biodegradable. And last but not least, government must take charge in ensuring we review the legal and regulatory framework. We provide public education and awareness for us to know the value of investing in social protection within the context of waste management. And as members of parliament, we need to do our work of ensuring we review and update the laws for them to be compliant, in ensuring we appropriate sufficient and necessary resources. But I want to chip in here that the budget is an instrument of the executive. They initiate it, we scrutinize, we recommend, and it can be overturned by the executive. But we have a role to play, certainly, in the appropriation. Thirdly is our oversight role. And I'm happy that teams over teams have moved to Chitezi to do oversight. Reports have been brought, debates done, recommendations given to the executive. But action is what is lacking. We need to walk the talk. And lastly, we must continue with advocacy to have a rights and equity-based approach to a comprehensive and sustainable waste management system in this country. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Honorable, for those recommendations. It was more like we had a conference and the participants came up with a final communique. We hope it is really taken on seriously. Honorable Flavia, in just a minute, please.
Time is up now that we should get not only a KCCA Act, but a Cities Act. All the town councils and cities in this country have developed dumping sites. I think Ministry of Water and Environment, you need to visit these sites and ensure you mitigate the Kitezi tragedy over all the sites. Fort Portal's land garbage field is almost filling up, and the people around it are complaining for the Fort Portal City garbage landfill, and I'm sure many other fields are bringing complaints, not only that are of death nature, but also health, of a health nature. Secondly, on advocacy, for us as the Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection, we want to advocate for an adaptive social protection system that will, ensure that we are prepared for the next disaster. And lastly, is building back better. Building back better is to prepare for whatever will come. Now will find us ready. Let us adapt a building back better approach. I know that even if we told the people at household level to disaggregate their garbage, it must be picked, collected. But when it is collected, it's collected at a fee. So that again becomes now another leakage, another challenge for the rural households. to be able to face the challenge of paying money for the garbage like we pay in town. But all in all, I think government still has the bigger role for sensitization, for mindset change, for preparedness, so that we are not a relief ministry. Because the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness has turned into a ministry of relief, that whenever we get a shock is when they will run around, but they are not ready to sit on their desks, they are not ready to get out there and monitor and assess situations so that we mitigate all these disasters that are coming. There is a disaster coming. On all the fuel stations we are planting like matoke. That is a disaster in waiting. And I don't know who I'm talking to, whether that person is listening, about the very many oil stations that we are planting as if we plant beans. And if a fire gutted, you know what will happen to us.
Well, I just want to thank you, Honorable Flavia, the chairperson of the Social Protection Committee of Parliament, or the Parliamentary Committee on Social Protection, and Honorable Dr. George. Thank you so much for your time. And of course, our viewer, I cannot forget to thank you so much. Well, we've been talking about landfills basically in the eye of Chitezi, but for me, I think we must move away from looking for land to have these landfills. We must have technology. Yes. Because one is enough with technology. Yes. We recycle, we have better industries than saying this place is filled up, we look for another place, we look for another place. There are a lot of hazards. What if we adopt various technologies? We can get a lot of energy out of this. There is so much we can do. How do we turn garbage into money? Into wealth. And when we turn this into wealth, yes, it will cease being a problem. I'm told various experts have come up with projects and are revised, but they have not seen the light of day. Why don't we scrutinize this and see? And lastly, let's investigate the economic businesses that were happening in Chitezi. Economic implications. Who stood to benefit? Could this be the reason why Chitezi, for a long time, remained despite being a disaster and confirmed by many? Have a lovely day. May the good Lord bless you. See you tomorrow, God willing, for God and my country.